At this point in time, the Japanese studio From Software needs no introduction. Widely known and renowned at this point in the gaming zeitgeist for their Soul series, a genre-defining franchise of games that transcends IPs with games like Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, all falling underneath their umbrella of games. Known at this point for their punishing difficulty and intense action RPG combat, the Soul series catapulted a studio that was known for their relatively underground status, making experimental games such as Kingsfield, Shadow Tower, and most known for their Armored Core series, at least here in America. For a long time, I had never really taken note of From Software. Mostly because Armored Core was not a game that I had any interest in while I was growing up. But when Demon's Souls hit the market, I was right there at the forefront. And while it didn't shoot the studio into absolute stardom, From Software did not have to wait long until that happened. Once Dark Souls was released onto the world, From Software became a household name in gaming, seemingly overnight. It was sort of like when you watch a movie and enjoy it, then years later Paul Rudd becomes a mega movie star, and then you rewatch Halloween 6, and you're like, holy shit, that was Paul fucking Rudd. I think the game that I had any sort of normal awareness of was their horror game Kuon, but that was still before a time that I was familiar at all with horror games in general. But once I was aware of From Software in the more mainstream sense, that's what it felt like to look back on Kuon. It was like watching Halloween 6. If you look at the studio's release schedule post the release of Dark Souls, you'll see a somewhat predictable, but not any less slightly depressing trend of their releases becoming nothing but the Souls-like games that they helped pioneer. But I figured for such a prolific studio that it would be a disservice to play only their Soulsborne games. So I decided to take a peek into their back catalog, and the first game that I decided to pick up was Echo Knight Beyond. It was the game that I had arguably heard about the most next to Kuon and Kingsfield in terms of the weird From Software games. If you had told me that there existed a From Software game that is a puzzle-oriented horror-tinged adventure set on a lunar space station, I would never in a million years expect anything less than an interesting, albeit somewhat flawed game that leaned more towards atmosphere more than anything. And while that's technically what I got, it was so much more than that, and not in a good way. Echo Knight Beyond Reanimator is the third in the From Software Echo Knight series, which all follow more or less a similar format. An adventure game taking place in the first person with item-based puzzles in a barren game world. The series up to this point had all only been loosely connected by game mechanics, and not really much more than that. Echo Knight Beyond the Return of the Joker is the last in the Echo Knight series so far, and it's the first and only to appear on the PS2. In it, you play as the series staple blank tulpa Richard, and while not much is given to you story-wise at the beginning, it's pretty obvious that you must wander around through a lunar space station to find your missing wife. I think the place that we need to start at here is obvious, and that is the overall gameplay, and this being a puzzle-focused adventure game, we must ask ourselves how the overall puzzle design succeeded or failed, and I believe that they failed. Terribly. While I'm not really an expert at the puzzle-based adventure game genre, I am well versed enough in a lot of the important heavy hitters such as like the Myst games, some of the Monkey Island games, and more sporadic entries throughout the 90s and early aughts. I think that a lot of the flack that the genre gets now and got during its heyday was the obtuseness of a lot of the game's puzzles that were drawn out and often made frustrating due to a sense that the developers needed to make sure that the customer got their money's worth equal to the time spent in the game. Games sold at this point in time were very rarely, if ever, digitally distributed, and even less so offered at a bargain price like today. A game that came out had to be mass-produced and sold as any other, so the standard price was the price for most of, if not all games sold on store shelves. It's not a secret that most adventure games, if you know what you're doing while playing them, can be beaten pretty quickly, as the main hurdle of the game is not reflexes or skill in the traditional sense of a video game, but being able to put your brain to the test and flex your ridges. The tougher and more obtuse the puzzles, the more time that you would have to spend in the game to figure out the solution. If you bought a game for $50 to $60, you didn't want to beat it in under an hour. You might feel gypped, ripped, and robbed. As times progressed, a lot of adventure games began to lighten up on the difficulty of overall puzzles. They still made you think, but a lot of puzzle games, at least the more mainstream ones, have managed to find a nice balance of brain teasers and the reasonable expectation that you will see the end credits. Echo Knight Beyond Thunderdome was released at a point somewhere right in the middle of these two eras of adventure games. A few of the puzzles are based around using a camera feed to find memories of people in the station, and using some of the info that you find towards a puzzle solution. But a majority of the puzzles are item-based. Find item, use the item, which, as I've stated before, is not a format that I have any issue with. Quite a bit of the puzzles are based around finding ghosts on the station and more or less relieving them of a post-mortem burden. The first puzzle in the game, for instance, involves a ghost who is blocking your path to the main part of the lunar station. The puzzle is finding a flask and giving it to him, which will cause him to evaporate into the ether and allow you to progress to the rest of the game. I would never argue that this formula of puzzles are bad, as a lot of my favorite games use this format. Resident Evil and Silent Hill 2 are huge games that are among my favorites of all time that oft use this puzzle format. So what is it exactly about Echo Knight Beyond the Clouds that make the puzzles abundantly terrible? Well, to put it simply, the game's puzzles aren't very difficult, yet they make me want to tear the skin off of my face due to simply one small thing. The puzzles aren't difficult due to putting pieces together. They are difficult simply because that a majority of them make the items that you need difficult to find or annoying to even get to, and those aren't mutually exclusive. For example, near the beginning of the game, you find yourself in a living quarter. There are 6 rooms, but only 5 that you can enter. In all of the rooms, there is a bathroom, a bedroom, a room with a sink and a shower, and a living room with a small kitchen area and several openable doors. I think that due to being able to open all of these little drawers and doors, you may think, well, there must be something inside one of these. I can even open the oven. And while most literally have nothing inside of them, you will notice that a few have some more innocuous stuff in them. Clothing and books, to name a few. But it becomes blatantly obvious that none of these objects are interactable, as the only thing that happens if you try to use the interact button on any of these is that your character will just close the door. So after examining every single interactable object in these 5 enterable rooms, I thought to myself, well, maybe this was just a showcase for the tech? Or hell, even maybe these were all just a divergent sort of implementation. And so I thought nothing else of it. But hours and hours later, you come across a ghost at a computer, and he's talking about how there is a prisoner that needs to be set free, and he is very, very angry about it. So logically, I think, okay, well maybe there's like a key or something lying around in the space station. I can't remember seeing any keys anywhere, but I start scouring. I go up and down all the hallways I can think of, looking in every nook and cranny I can see, and there's nothing. Nothing I have in my inventory implies any sort of solution, despite me giving the guy literally everything in my pockets. I walk aimlessly and painfully slow on the lunar station about 2 times, and then after about another hour wandering around completely stumped, I cave in and look at a walkthrough. Turns out, one of the cabinets in the living quarters has a piece of paper that you need to give to the computer guy. What? Okay, fine, it's just whatever. Maybe I didn't see it, and that's on me. I walk back, and I go into the specified room, and I look in the cabinet. I can't interact with anything in there, and I don't see the paper. I try interacting with this little fucking thing, because it's the biggest and most glaring object sitting in there, and still nothing. I start getting very frustrated, thinking that my game copy must be bugged or something. No. Turns out that the piece of paper is up here, almost invisible on the top shelf, completely parallel with the surface that it's sitting on. This isn't good puzzle design. This is an obtuse game of I Spy. And what makes matters worse in this department is that there are several puzzles where either items that you need are hidden, or even just the pathway to get there is obscured and difficult to even see. So what happens is that you will be often wandering around looking for some obscure detail, which for an adventure game is often par for the course. But the difference here is that for whatever reason, the developers decided to make your walking speed unbearably slow. I'm sure to some extent it's there for atmosphere, as the slow walking speed can let you sit in the ambience of the space station and take a lot of the environment in. There is also a run button that you will be utilizing quite a bit, which is a thankful addition, but none of that matters when you walk onto the lunar surface. There are a few sections of the lunar surface in the game, and whenever you find yourself on the surface of the moon, you will immediately notice that your already slow walk speed is cut in half, and that your run no longer runs, but instead makes you leap forward in an awkward, floaty moon jump. These points all come to a head when at one point you reach a graveyard at the farthest end point of the game. There is an incredibly large chasm that you have to walk on some metal pathways to maneuver around to get to, but once you arrive you will see a ghost praying between gravestones. She'll spout some by the numbers From Software nonsense, and then naturally you will want to examine all of the gravestones. Maybe there is important information on one of them. Maybe there's an item. No. Weird. Okay. Well, maybe I have to find something to give to this ghost. So I wander back to the main station and just find myself aimlessly walking. And then eventually, after another 40 minutes of not finding anything that I could possibly be of any use, I use another walkthrough. Turns out the pathway is back at the graveyard. Did you see it? 'Cause I didn't, and I went back to the graveyard at least twice beforehand. So I have to suffer through the unbearably painful walk speed on the lunar surface again, and then find this pathway that is in the graveyard. Do you see it? This wouldn't really be all that bad if the speed of the game wasn't so excruciatingly slow. I could probably run across a majority of the map in the Resident Evil remake in the amount of time that it takes me to walk from the top of the mining area to the graveyard, which is seriously about 5 rooms long. Echo Knight Beyond the Pines is almost afraid of accepting its inherent puzzle box design and allowing itself to be broken. Throughout just about every area of the game, it feels like the developers are doing everything they can to make sure you get at least 12 hours out of the game, in a game that should only really take about 5 to 7 on your first run. This leads me to another issue with the converging mechanics in the game, which are death states. This game is technically a horror game in an incredibly light sense of the word. There is a looming sense of possible death around a lot of corners. The most likely way that you will die is from being, I guess, scared to death from interactions with ghosts. I can only assume that's what's happening. And some points of the game just involve a ghost popping up and killing the main character if you're not prepared for it. The living quarters in particular involves the second interaction with a deadly ghost, and you only really get a tiny window of time to make it to a safe room, otherwise you're just dead. Hell, you can even get to the door in time, but still walk out on the other side of the door dead as a doornail. There is one room in particular with the priest ghost that involves you having to fuck around with the station's camera system in this particular room before you can even enter it, because if you go there without doing so, you're just fucked. And I died over 10 times at this piece of shit. Over and over and over, you just have to tread water, wondering what you're doing wrong, or wondering where the developers may have hid the next item that you need to progress. And adding a death state to this just makes the possibility of dying over and over again, and you not even sure at what you're doing wrong, or at the very least what you're supposed to be doing, very likely. The most egregious area in my opinion though is, well, remember that lunar surface path? Well, you need to go there to actually find a very important item. But it's not at the top of this path. It's way the fuck over there by the ladder at the beginning of this area. The only way to get to it is by hopping between 2 weird tram things that are, of course, sitting 1.5 million miles above a giant moon hole riddled with death and regret. So you have to climb up this hill, wait for this lift to come get you, wait for it to hover over the pit, line your jump, time your jump well enough, and then jump slowly, because, you know, you're on the fucking moon, and then wait for it to go all the way across this huge chasm, and then finally you can claim this item. Now, luckily, I didn't die more than once at this section. But if you look at just about any walkthrough for this game, they will acknowledge how bullshit this part of the game is, and how tricky this jump is. I got lucky. But can you imagine having to go from the nearest save point all the way down this elevator, wait for the pressure to unlock, then crawl all the way back up to the lift, wait for it, climb onto it, and then make the jump, and then just to fall and die? Meaning you'd have to do the whole thing again? The trek to the lift itself is just over 5 minutes. The biggest threat that the game has isn't dying. Dying in this game is an illusion. The real threat that this game poses to you is just forcing you to play it for longer. You know, I'm really sorry that I'm being so harsh on this game. I honestly went into it thinking I was going to have an enjoyable time. I really wanted to like this, and it bums me out that I'm sitting here talking to you at this tone and having to be so critical and downright spiteful at it for practically just wasting my time. At this point, you might be wondering if there is anything about the game I did enjoy. Well, the game's atmosphere is something worth talking about. The atmosphere in Echo Night Beyond Cyberspace is almost presented in a way that many would consider to be thick and heavy. It's attempting to emulate the actual atmosphere that would probably be present in an abandoned space station. The beginning of the game has some honestly great moments. The garbled droid right when you boot up the game in the crashed coach seating area is a fantastic way to start. Leading into your first puzzle with the ghost droning on and on about the dead cements this sort of oppressive, isolating atmosphere that the game was going for. But as it goes on, it has some occasional moments of spiked oppressiveness, such as the hallway where all of the lights are out, and your movement is slowed considerably and a ghostly handprint shows up on your visor. It was one of the few moments that actually got under my skin a little bit. The contrast between this section and a lot of the game is stark, and it's very effective. I was genuinely uncomfortable and uneasy seeing this, and even more so when I realized exactly what was happening. I think I can sum up why the atmosphere doesn't really work for me in this little comparison. You know Dead Space? I don't know if you know this, but Dead Space, pretty good game. Well, I think that one of the highlights of Dead Space is the zero gravity, or the space sections, where you're in the vacuum of space itself, and the only sounds that you hear are the heavy, strained, and panicked breathing of Isaac, the main character. Now, can you imagine if all of Dead Space was that very silent, yet still kind of jarring intensity of the vacuum of space? After a while, it wouldn't really be that intense or jarring, because if the entirety of the game is just silence, then there's no real contrast. There's no jarring aspect to it, because the entire experience is just that. Well, welcome to Echo Night Beyond the Atomic Bomb. There are areas of pure diegetic ambience that I think are worthy of the kind of feel that the game was going for. The problem that Echo Night Beyond Good and Evil has in terms of atmosphere is that unless you're being chased or interacting with a ghost, then the atmosphere is pretty much always at this like weird kind of silent negative space. Where Dead Space excelled in this sort of atmosphere was sporadically putting you into the vacuum and leaving you with only the breathing of Isaac, Echo Night Beyond Justice is 80% of the time putting you in this isolating atmosphere with nothing, no real sound effects and no real mood setting. So, like, half of that 80% is pure boredom with no real hook in terms of atmosphere. You may think that Dark Souls might be a fair comparison in terms of the lack of music, or in another light, the commitment to diegetic ambience. But if you ask me, the fact that Dark Souls isn't really trying to be spooky is partly why I think that its atmosphere is a much better attempt at the more realistic in-game sounds and audio. When Dark Souls does attempt to kind of get spooky like in the Catacombs, it blows Echo Night Beyond the Arcade out of the water at its own game. I will say, however, that graphically, the game is a marvel. At a glance, I wouldn't be surprised if most people could mistake this for a 360 game. The whole game has this clean sheen to it, and the shadow effects are really impressive. They're not as utilized as something like the Silent Hill games, but they are all real time and they look fantastic. The game sends you to a small variety of locations, but a lot of them mostly have the same uniform, sort of modern take on 70s era future space tech. There's a strange fog that is used as a plot point, and it's a decent effect that is used as an indicator of danger in the area, which is arguably effective. The lunar station really shows off the power that the PS2 was capable of, and the tech presented here is very impressive. It's even more applaud-worthy when you remember that the people that managed to pull this out of the console were a niche studio at the time. There really isn't much more I can say on the graphics department, because as much as I think the graphics are astoundingly good, they don't really help add to the atmosphere in the way that they should be. If I'm not engrossed in your game's atmosphere and left wanting by it, the graphics are just sort of a coat of paint. A shockingly good coat of paint, but it's a painting and not a structure, if you know what I mean. And now, after all of that, would I say this game is hopeless? Is it something that I would never recommend to anyone? What audience is Echo Knight Beyond Two Souls for? Well, okay. Hear me out. If you like adventure games, and you are craving an indulgent adventure that really does challenge you, and you can put up with the walking speed, and put up with the items that are occasionally intimidatingly hard to find, then yes, go for it. To anyone else that has made it this far into the video and is still not deterred by my words, then play the game, but with a walkthrough. I can only imagine and promise that playing this way, while knowing exactly what to do, is probably beneficial to your time with it. It would help you involve yourself into the game's world and atmosphere when you can take it in and straight shot your way through the game. Not staying too long in any section would allow you to take it all in and not have to be stuck for an extended period of time. This would make the game feel fresh and not frustrating. Feeling frustrated and being stuck in one area for long enough will kill any game's atmosphere. So yeah, after all of that, I would say if you want to, play the game just with a walkthrough. Don't allow yourself to end the game like I did. That might have been one of the worst games I've ever played that was competently made. That was competently built. That might have been one of the worst fucking games I've ever played. Maybe I should look at some other From Software games and see how they hold up.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.